Greetings from Mesa United Methodist Church of Albuquerque, New Mexico. We hope this message will be meaningful and relevant to your life and your relationship with God. We invite you to join us for worship on Sunday mornings. Our traditional service is at 8:30 a.m. and at 11 a.m. we gather for contemporary worship. More information may be found at our website, mesaviewumc.com. Now may you be blessed through the reading and hearing of God's holy word.
The second scripture reading is from Luke chapter 22, verse 66 through chapter 23, verse 25. When day came, the assembly of the elders of the people, both chief priests and scribes, gathered together, and they brought him to their council. They said, "If you are the Messiah, tell us." He replied, "If I tell you, you will not believe. And if I question you, you will not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the power of God." All of them asked, "Are you then the Son of God?" He said to them, "You say that I am." Then they said, "What further testimony do we need? We have heard it ourselves from his own lips." Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priest and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priest and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they were enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us." This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder. And he handed Jesus over as they wished. This is the word of God for you and me, the people of God.
Thanks be to God. In his excellent book, Jesus on Death Row, law professor in United Methodist Mark Osler says that the trial of Jesus that we find in Scripture, not just in Luke but the other Gospels as well, is remarkably similar to what we see in capital cases that take place today. At least at the 30,000-foot level, there are great similarities between what happens with Jesus and what happens at the trial and what we see in current trials. And yet, at the same time, if we try and apply our understanding of what takes place in trials today, such as the right to a defense attorney, the right not to incriminate yourself and testify against yourself, the assumption that the court is going to presume you innocent until they're otherwise proven that you're guilty, if we take those assumptions and apply them to this trial, we also miss a large portion of what's going on. But the story of Jesus' trial is very different from what we know and perhaps what we think we know about trials. In addition, the people of the Passion that we encounter in the trial are very different than those we encountered last week at the cross when we began looking at the people of the Passion. Because the people we find at the cross are, for the most part, common, ordinary citizens. Even the soldiers there are of the lowest order. But those that we find at the trial are the elites of Jewish and Roman society. Well, not maybe the top 1%, certainly they're in the top 5% of society. And that even includes those who are the religious leaders, made up in Luke's verbiage of the council and other gospels referred to as the Sanhedrin. And they not only have religious authority, they have political authority within the realm as well. And this is not like a group like Congress where they're democratically elected amongst the populace and they're rotating in and out. These are more people like the British House of Lords, where you get your seat because of the family that you're born into and also because of the money that you might have. This includes the high priest, not named by Luke, but his name here is Caiaphas. The high priest is not chosen amongst those that we think are the most religious, the most devout in their practice. It was actually a political position appointed by the Roman governor. So it's somebody who can play the game the best, and all the wheeling and dealing that goes behind the scenes. Caiaphas' father-in-law is a man named Ananias, who was himself one time high priest, and has been responsible for having the last 5 high priests appointed to their positions before Caiaphas comes into place. And Caiaphas has a fairly long reign as high priests go, which means he knows how to play the game very, very well. How to keep the Romans appeased, and how to keep the Jewish elites appeased at the same time. And that's not an easy task, to try to keep these two sometimes divergent groups happy with each other. And in order to do that, the ends justify the means. So whatever he has to do to make sure both parties stay assured to keep himself in power and also to keep himself alive, he'll do. There are times when we might come into positions of power or authority, and in order to stay in that position, we might have the opportunity or the challenge to go down the wrong path, to do things that we might not otherwise do in order to stay in that position. We might even rationalize it that we're still doing the best good for the greatest number of people, that if somebody else was in our position, they wouldn't be as good as we are. But as soon as we make one decision going down the wrong road, it's much easier to make a new series of decisions that build and lead off of that first bad decision. This week I heard about an ambulance company in Mumbai, India, known as the 1298 Ambulance Company. Their number is also the number you call to have them respond. When they began in 2005, there were 3 ambulance companies in Mumbai, the city the size of New York City. And for the most part, none of those ambulance companies served the poor, because they couldn't afford to pay for the ambulance to come. And so as this company was being formed, one of their goals was to serve everybody regardless of their ability to pay. And so they have a sliding scale. If you can't pay, they don't charge you, but they'll still show up and take you to the hospital. And if you're wealthy, then you get charged accordingly for what you can pay. But as they began, they called the phone company because they wanted to get an emergency number that's easy to remember. So they talked about 911 or 999, the two most prevalent numbers around the world. And what they were told is that they could do that, but they would have to pay a bribe to some officials to get that number set up. And so they said that wasn't acceptable, that if they were going to set a new standard, not just for what it meant to be an ambulance service in Mumbai, but maybe even set a new standard for what it meant to do business in Mumbai, they couldn't begin that process by committing an unethical act. Because that first unethical act would lead to more unethical acts. It would set the culture for where they were going, and they wanted to be going in a different direction. And so they therefore took the number that was available to them, 1298. Not as easy to remember as 911 or 999, but it created a culture that they weren't going to do unethical actions. They were going to be as ethical as they could be in order to keep going down the wrong path. That sort of leads us, I think, then to Herod and Pontius Pilate. There are three Herods that we find in the Gospels. First, there is Herod the Great, the one who is appointed as over the head of Judea by the Romans, whose title is King of the Jews. He is the one who encounters the wise men, and then orders the execution of all male children under the age of 2. And upon his death in the year 4 BC, that is, Jesus was born before he was actually born, by our calendar, his territory is divided up amongst his sons. One of those is Herod Archelaus, who is the one who's overseeing Judea when Jesus and Mary and Joseph are coming back out of exile in Egypt. And Joseph doesn't want to go back to Bethlehem because Herod Archelaus is ruling there, and he fears him. And rightfully so, because that Herod's actually removed from power by the Roman Empire because of his brutality. And you have to be really brutal to have the Romans remove you from your position. And so instead of going back to Bethlehem, they go then to Galilee, to Nazareth, which is where his other brother, Herod Antipas, is the ruler. He is the one who's in Jerusalem for this trial, the one that Jesus goes to see. This Herod is not a nice guy either. He's the one who orders the execution of John the Baptist because John had the temerity to stand up and challenge him on his marriage to his brother's wife, although it wasn't an ex-wife at the time that they got married. They were still married to his brother. Now, one of the interesting things we're told is that Herod's sort of excited to have Pilate send Jesus to him because he wants to meet him. He says he's heard things about him. What we've heard is unknown, but we do know earlier in Luke, he records that there are a group of women who are financial supporters of Jesus and the disciples. One of them is Mary Magdalene, but one of them is the wife of Herod's steward, Chusa. That's his right-hand man. In the book of Acts, we're told that Manaen is also a member of Herod's court and a follower of Christ. So he has people in his retinue who know of Jesus and are at least interested or followers of Jesus. We are also told that he had been planning a plot to kill Jesus. And some Pharisees come to Jesus to warn him about this, and Jesus says, "Go tell Herod where I am, where he can find me." And then he calls Herod a fox. We probably have some foxes that we've dealt with in our lives, and I'm not talking about people whose last name is Fox or people who are attractive. This is a different type of fox. More like wolves. Wolves in sheep's clothing. And sometimes we think in order to deal with those people that we have to lower ourselves to their level, that we have to play on the same playing ground in order to stay even. But what we see in Jesus is Jesus says, "I'm not stooping to his level. If he wants me, come and get me." He stands up to the bully. That's usually the harder option to do, but nearly always the correct one. Say, if that's the way you want to live, great, but I'm not going to do that. So I'm not going to play the way you're playing the game. But here, Herod doesn't try and kill Jesus. Instead, he asks Jesus for a sign. Prove to me who you say you are. This is a common trope we find in the Gospels, people asking Jesus for a sign, and he always says, no, I'm not going to show you a sign. You shouldn't need a sign. Because what it really says is, you're not paying any attention. I'm going around healing people. What more sign do you need? Come and listen to the messages I'm giving about God. What more sign do you need? So asking me for a sign says you're not paying any attention to what's actually going on here. But then Herod begins mocking Jesus, as do the soldiers, and they send him back to Pilate. I don't really believe the portrayal that's given here of Herod. From what we know of how he behaves, it seems if he had the opportunity to kill Jesus, he would have taken that. And so why he doesn't is sort of unknown, but this sort of coming off as a nice guy who doesn't want to, there's something lacking there. The same as the betrayal of Pilate is also a little hard to believe, because he comes off as a simple capitulator at best, or a weakling at worst, and just obeying whatever the Jewish leaders ask him to do. But that's not the picture of Pilate that we have in the record. Philo of Alexandria, a Jewish writer in the first century, says, Pilate was naturally inflexible and full of vindictiveness and a furious temper. Pilate was regularly offending Jewish authorities. He had ordered in shields and standards with Roman imperial insignia on them to be placed into Jerusalem, including on the Temple Mount, which the Jewish authorities actually petitioned the emperor to have them removed because it's so offensive to their practice of Judaism. He was accused of stealing money from the Jewish temple in order to build an aqueduct in Jerusalem through a Jewish cemetery, violation of Jewish law. There's also an earlier account in Luke of Pilate ordering the killing of several Galileans who are worshiping in the temple and having their blood mixed with the blood offering given in the temple. So he's not just one who sort of just bows down to Roman authorities, nor is he this really sort of nice guy. Later, after Jesus' death, he is ordered to return to Rome by the emperor for his behavior, to answer for the slaughter of some Samaritans who are worshiping on Mount Gerizim, their holy sites. And as a result of this action, he is then replaced as the prefect, the governor of Judea. So those stories, the brief ones we have, don't match this image of Pilate that we have here in the Gospels as someone who doesn't want to send Jesus to death. He is killing people all over the place. So why does he have this hesitation about sending Jesus? I mean, he says, I find him innocent, but I'm going to flog him. He's not going to get away with nothing, but I don't want to kill him. Now, only Roman authorities could order the execution of somebody. And as I said last week when we looked at the cross, crucifixion was reserved specifically for those who challenged Roman authority, those who were seen as a threat to the empire or threats to the social structure. And so it's clear by Jesus being crucified that he was ordered by Pilate to be killed. That at least matches up with the gospel story, that it was not the Jewish leaders, even if they sent him, who could have overseen that execution. But it still doesn't sort of match up with this image of Pilate as coming off as maybe a weakling, or maybe a nice guy who wants the innocent to go free. That's not Pilate's compunction. So we might ask then, why is Pilate pictured like this? Well, the general consensus among historians and scholars is because of what's happening at the time that the Gospels are being written. Mark, the earliest Gospel written somewhere between 68 and 71, which is right at the time of the Jewish revolts. The Jews in Palestine rise up to throw off their oppressors as represented by Rome. Rome initially thinks it's a little fleet, they can flick them away, and in doing so, they don't send the reinforcements necessary, and actually the Roman army suffers one of the worst disasters, worst defeats in the history of the Roman Empire. So then Rome gets serious and sends several legions to Palestine, and they lay siege to Jerusalem, break down the walls, and destroy the Temple Mount. And so the Gospels are beginning to be written down right at this time, when being a Jew is not a good thing, and in being a follower of somebody who's been executed by the Roman Empire for leading potential insurrections is an even worse thing. And so the guess is they're sort of setting Pilate and Herod up as saying Jesus wasn't responsible, to make it first look like they're not following somebody who's causing an insurrection, as well as to say, go after the Jews. But we as Christians, followers of Christ, we're okay. We're not a threat to the empire. Treat us differently than the way you're treating everybody else, because Christian persecution is already beginning with Emperor Nero in mid-60s, leading potentially to the execution of Paul and Peter in Rome as well. And so Pilate sort of has this nicer image put onto him later in the church. When we say our creedal statements, we say that Jesus suffered under Pontius Pilate. So the real belief in Pilate comes back into the church a little bit later. But that leads us then to the understanding of crucifixion and violence and peacefulness. Leads us to the last person mentioned in today's passage, and that's Barabbas, who the crowds reportedly cried to have released. And we should note here that this crowd here that cries for crucifixion is not the same one who are crying Hosanna when Jesus comes into the temple. It's only a small fraction of the 60,000 to 80,000 people who would have come into Jerusalem each year for the Passover celebration. But we are told that Barabbas is a revolutionary, one who's led an insurrection within Jerusalem, and one in which people have been killed. This is exactly the type of person that Rome wants to execute, to make examples of. But there's an interesting thing about Barabbas, and that is Bar in Hebrew means son of. And Abba, most of you know, means father. So his name, Barabbas, means son of the Father. That's what we call Jesus, Son of God, Son of the Father. In some manuscripts traditions, he's actually referred to as Jesus Barabbas. Jesus, the Son of the Father, versus Jesus, the Son of the Father, the Christ. So why is that significant? Well, because we have a choice. We can follow Jesus Barabbas, who wants warfare and violence and retribution, or we can follow Jesus the Christ, who calls for peace and says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, turn the other cheek. If someone forces you to carry their bag, carry it for them 2 miles. Who overcomes the world not through violence done by him, but violence done through him on the cross." It says that the cross is more powerful than the sword, that love is more powerful than hate. That peace is more powerful than violence. So this sets up this dichotomy. Who are you going to choose to follow? And by the years of the Jewish revolt, it's clear who they're following: Jesus Barabbas. Crucify the peaceful guy. Let's go after the guy who can try to get rid of the Romans for us. We still have that same thing for us today. Who are we going to choose? Are we going to choose to follow the way of warfare and bombing people? Or are we going to choose the way of peace, dealing with people, trying to bring reconciliation? But there's also one other thing I think we have to decide. It's easy to say, looking back, if we had been there, we'd have done something different. If we would have been one of the disciples, we'd have been there. We would have said we were going to be faithful. Man, Peter, he might have disappeared, but we'd have been there. We'd have been faithful to the end. It's really easy to make those statements from afar. We do that, see that on the news all the time. Somebody does something or doesn't do something. "Oh, if I'd have been there, I'd have done something. You could have counted on me." It's easy to say that from afar, but when you're in the midst of those situations, it's entirely different. Especially when we think about the power of groupthink. And we talk about peer pressure amongst teenagers and try to give them strategies for how to deal with it. and how to overcome it. But the peer pressure we have as adults is just as much and sometimes more severe because the outcomes are more severe. So if you knew that the company you worked for was making an unsafe product, would you stand up and say something about it? If the people that you worked with were in unsafe environments, would you stand up and do something about it? What if speaking up you knew would cause you to lose your job? And not just lose your job, but probably lose your career, because then you'll be labeled as a whistleblower. You'll be blackballed in your industry. Would you stand up? Or would you just go along because that's the easier thing to do? Sometimes it's easier just to keep your mouth shut. Keep going. Not rock the boat. And sometimes there are things that are, you should stand up about that are insignificant. Sometimes there are serious things that happen when there's serious things on the line. In the 1950s, a scientist by the name of Solomon Asch did a series of studies, now famous studies, about conformity. And he had participants take a simple exam in which they had to say whether two lines were the same length or different lengths. And those who came in and did it individually, 95% of them answered all the questions correctly. He then brought a group of people together. What the volunteers didn't know is that everybody else in the room were actors. And the actors had been told to give the wrong answer. And when they were in a group of people, the response rate was no longer 95% correct answers, it was now 25% correct answers. A 70% difference when answering by themselves or answering in a group. In a recent update of that experiment, scientists wondered, what's going on in the brain that would cause that disparity? And so they hooked the participants up to an fMRI machine to sort of analyze what areas of the brain are being activated during the process. And what their initial hypothesis was is they expected the frontal lobe to light up, because that's where rational thought is, that the brain would be processing through how they could make some justification in their mind to give the wrong answer, that the lines were not the same length or were different lengths, whatever it might be. But what they actually found is it was not the frontal lobe that lit up. It was actually the center of the brain where mental imagery takes place. That the brain was actually not rationalizing some decision, it was making the image fit the answer that they were giving. So it wasn't rationalizing line, it was changing the length of the lines to make them match what they were saying, so that they would not be inconsistent in their answers. Now that should send chills down our spines of thinking about how groupthink works and our ability to rationalize the answers that we give, because we don't rationalize it. Our brain makes it work for us. And so maybe that's why when the Sanhedrin is meeting, the Joseph of Arimathea, who's a member, who later stands up to Pilate and says, "Give me Jesus' body," doesn't stand up to the Sanhedrin and say, "This is wrong." That he goes along with it, at least by all appearances. That he gives into the groupthink. Now later he stands up, so that should give us some courage that even if we go along and we make a mistake, it's not too late. We can stand up later and say, "No, that shouldn't have happened." But all too often we go along with the group. Friday was the anniversary of the date in which we started to inter Japanese Americans during World War II. Took away their homes and their businesses, everything they had, and locked them up. American citizens, because we were fearful of them because they were different, the other. Maria Popova says, all violence requires an other as its target. All violence requires an other as its target. And we will make even people we love the other, demeaning them, making them less than us, so that we can wreak out violence on them. But there's one other piece in the studies on groupthink and conformity that we should pay attention to. And that is a similar series of experiments. A group of people, full of actors except for one volunteer who doesn't know that everybody else in the room is an actor. And when all the actors gave the right answer, the single participant was more likely to go along with the group. But in another set of experiments, one other actor was told to give a different answer than what the rest of the group was saying, even if it too was a wrong answer. And when that happened, the response rate stopped being 25%, it went back up to 95%. Even when there were two wrong answers given, people started giving the right answer because just one other person speaking up broke the mentality of the group. That's why we talk about devil's advocates. When the church the Catholic Church is nominating saints, they have a trial. And there is one person who comes in and brings up every piece of bad information they can present to break up the group thing, to make sure it's not just being railroaded through. The same thing happens in other groups. One person saying something different breaks up the group and allows people to express a different opinion. Now, being that first person to speak and say something different is the hardest thing. If you've ever been to a funeral and they say, would somebody like to stand up and give some witness? That first person to stand up is always the hardest one. Then it just sort of flows from there. Being the first person to say, no, that answer I think is wrong, even if our opinion is wrong, allows other people to express their own ideas. So if there's one thing I think we can learn from the example of the people involved in the trial of Jesus, it's about the dangers of a group mentality, as well as the danger of making political expedient decisions, of saying that the ends will justify the means, rather than seeking to make the right decision. Because we as Christians are called to do and to be something different. We're called not to answer the powers and principalities of the world, whatever form they might take. We're not called to support the status quo, whatever that might be. We're called to proclaim the kingdom of God and then to live into it. That's what we heard in that passage from Philippians. Don't imitate Paul, imitate Christ. We're not called simply to support what society is doing. We are called to support something higher. We are called to be faithful witnesses to our faith, and to what God has called us to do and God has called us to be. And sometimes that will require us to step up and speak out, to step outside of our comfort zones, go way out there on a limb. Sometimes that limb might even be cut off behind us. But that's part of the cost of being a disciple, part of what it means when Jesus says that we are to pick up our cross and follow. To follow daily is to understand the cost that comes with discipleship. I pray that it will be so, my brothers